for those that are early in their relationship, how do you suggest couples kind of approach this topic of money, especially if we want to ensure like transparency and trust?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think there's lots of ways to approach it. I think the first thing is just to commit to talking about it, right? It's one of those topics that we tend to want to avoid. It's uncomfortable. It's such a taboo, right, in our society. We will talk about our sex lives with our friends much more than we'll talk about, our money and our bank account balances in some ways. So I think the first thing is to, again, contextualize it at a time that makes sense. So I'm not saying on the first date you have to, bring out your bank statements or bring up, your mobile banking
credit
app.
report.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a second date thing, right?
Totally. Yeah. Well, I like to say it's before you go on a trip together, right? That should, often early on in your relationship, you're like, oh, it'll be fun to take a road trip. It's summer, let's go somewhere. And that's a perfect time to say, we haven't really talked about money yet. We're going to be spending money on a place to stay. There's lots of different ways to get there, right? We could drive, we could fly, we could take a bus, right? And so it's a great time to just start to offer your own perspectives. And everyone has money stories, right? We all have these baggage, if you want to call it, or stories from when we grew up and how we were raised that we bring subconsciously or sometimes very consciously into relationships. And so just to even voice those and being the one to go first can be really helpful to say, I'll share some of my money stories.
The idea of just simply saying in the back of your mind, I'll bring money up just before our first trip. I love it because I feel like that it is creating naturally an environment where those questions will just arise. How much do you plan on spending? How much would you like to spend on this vacation? And there's so many directions you can go with that. How important is travel to you? Do you have, like right now, are you trying to reduce your debt?
Totally.
Maybe we need to do this on the cheap because you have student loan debt. Like just natural ways where people don't feel like that they're being attacked, because you're not attacking them. You're just trying to understand them, understand the circumstances. And I can think of 15 different questions right off the top of my head just from that opportunity that's created to ask the questions just before you travel. So thanks for sharing that.
Oh, and I love it too. I totally agree, Brian, with all those questions you just asked, because you're planning. You have to kind of go through that planning. So it's natural, but then you've opened this door. So as you said, if you go on like a road trip, now you're in a car for, 6, 9 hours, 10 hours a day. You've opened this conversation. And so you can then start expanding to like, what your parents did with their money, or like how they talked about it, or what are the future trips you're planning, like all these other financial questions as well.
Totally. You've normalized money as a topic of conversation, and therefore it can be casual the next time you bring it up, and your partner might be so relieved of like, oh, thank goodness that I can now talk about the fact that I am paying down student debt. I mean, right. I can't wait for the Netflix series where a couple meets and falls in love and discloses their educational debt to each other, because it's just not normalized in our society to bring these topics up. And yet for so many of us, it's a huge element of what we're spending every month. So it's something that I think we just need to normalize the topic and take whatever opportunity we can to make it seem less forced. And I think the travel does that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a assignment in one of my classes that actually makes them go talk to their partners if they have a partner about money, which is a stressful event in itself. But the number one thing I hear about afterwards is, I've been waiting to have this conversation. And it's just because they don't, from my students and from their partners, like, because they just haven't had the conversation. And I love that a road trip or just a trip in general, that's a great introduction. It's a real easy way to get into it. If you don't have a, demanding professor like me that makes you go do it.
Well, I like to say blame the book, right? If you read the book and you say, oh, I just read this book called Money and Love, and I realized like we haven't had any of these conversations. let's sit down. Let's actually go on a financial date. I like this concept. And just, get a bottle of wine, like pair it with a treat to have something to look forward to. So it doesn't feel like this daunting thing.